And this slide, again, sorry, the font is a little small here, but basically you've got various rainbow colors here. Individuals with these green lines are people who exhibited the fastest walking speed on this very expensive hallway runner. And individuals down here in red are people who exhibited the slowest walking speed. And so if we only target 70-year-olds, for example, the fastest walking 70-year-olds on average will live about another 30 years. The slowest walking 70-year-olds on average are only going to live another 10 years. Mathematical models, lots of assumptions here. There are some concerns with these, but they're typically based on large sample sizes. And before you beat me to the punch, walking speed does not cause mortality. It doesn't cause cognitive decline. It's indicative of the overall biological integrity of your system, basically. And so individuals in particular who would present in our lab, let's say as part of this PREVENT study, who would be in the lower percentiles, the slowest walkers, those are people in particular that we would be interested in aggressively targeting for some lifestyle interventions. The final thing, it's not the final thing, it's a very big study, but genetic markers, I think many in the room will be interested in. I get asked about this quite a bit as well. Genes, quite simply, code for various proteins in our body, and every one of them is necessary. It serves a very specific function. And at least one school of thought suggests that, well, some of these genetic predispositions also might be useful to index. When we're born, we have a specific set of genes, and these are congenital, as it were. The genetics, the genes themselves aren't changing. However, whether or not a gene is expressed or not depends on how you live your life. It's what they refer to as gene by environment interactions. So simply because you have a risk gene for a certain disease doesn't mean that that is going to be actualized. In part, it will depend on how you're living your life as well, your diet, your exercise, and so on. And in terms of the PREVENT study, again with the help of several crack graduate students, we've really targeted a basket of risk genes that likely would share the greatest association with what we believe the mechanisms are underlying Alzheimer's disease. And some of these are vascular, and so you see here, this is a fairly ugly term. Apolipoprotein E is one specific gene that's often targeted, and it, in fact, of all the genes known to science-dom, if you will, it is the most important risk factor gene for Alzheimer's disease. They've studied many hundreds of thousands of what's called SNPs, which are variants on a gene, and this is the one that comes out the strongest every time. And it makes sense that this one's important because it's involved in other facets of our health, such as our vascular health. The risk allele of this gene, the poor version or poor copy of this gene, is involved with very poor cholesterol transport within our bloodstream. So cholesterol is the natural occurring fatty substance, and too much of that is not good. And if we've got a poor version of this gene, our body is also not able to deal with cholesterol as effectively. And there's also a good copy of this gene that actually is uber efficient at dealing with cholesterol. This is what annoys me, I think, the most about the genetics, is it gets back to base rate again as well. And it's certainly common in the US, and it's becoming more popular in Canada, these boutique genetic screening options where you can pay a certain amount of money and you can have your genome sequenced, and they will indicate to you if you have risk factor genes for certain things. I personally would never do it. I think there are ethical concerns with having people pay to do it, and in this case, having the worst version of apolipoprotein, even if you have both alleles, your risk of becoming demented only increases to about 25 or 30%. And that says nothing about how you're living your life. If you have a good diet, if you watch your weight, there are many other ways, for example, that you can address the faulty cholesterol transport associated with those risk genes. And so that would be my take-home message there, that simply because you're predisposed or you have an increased risk, it is absolutely not certain that you will be afflicted with whatever this gene is a risk for. Enough about the science. What can I do in terms of my personal life to mitigate my risk of becoming demented or experiencing cognitive decline? And I say this is absolutely true. Not only are we not there, we're nowhere near being able to prevent cognitive decline or Alzheimer's disease. We don't even properly understand the mechanisms, despite an awful lot of wonderful research on this. Like most things related to health, it's exceedingly complex, and the machinations of science move slowly. But each new study provides new hope and new information. What I can say is that there's an awful lot of risk factors that overlap between Alzheimer's disease and other diseases that are very common with increasing age, cancer and cardiovascular disease, for example. And we know to a certain extent how to prevent about 50% of cancers and 80% of cardiovascular disease if you pay attention to diet, have reasonable nutrition, eat your leafy greens, exercise at least a little bit, curtail your smoking, don't consume too much alcohol. All the fundamental risk factors for these things, you actually have a pretty good fighting bet of not being afflicted by cancer or cardiovascular disease. And that's saying something, because these are amongst the two most common diseases with increasing age. So our hope is we can learn something about those literatures and apply it to our understanding of risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And here's why having some control is important, at least in my mind it's important. If these are US statistics, but pro rata based on the population size, the estimates are very comparable in Canada. If you look at the left-hand side, if we do nothing, if we don't target any interventions, if we just continue to live our lives the way we are, I think the estimates are fairly solid. At least in the US, there's about 3 million Alzheimer's cases right now, and by the year almost 2050, that'll triple. There'll be 9 million cases. And of course, as you scale down along this graph, things start looking a little bit better. Let's say each of us goes home. Let's say each of us walks home from here and makes a concerted effort to taking public transit, walking more regularly than we already do, and these sorts of things, that we might be able to start delaying the onset. I'm not talking about prevention, because we honestly don't know yet what the fundamental mechanisms are or the risk factors to really focus on prevention. But let's say exercise would even delay the onset by 2 years, or in a best case scenario by 5 years. That initial estimate that I talked about, 3 million, it doesn't even reach 5 million by 2047. We've cut by more than a factor of 2 individuals who are likely to become demented. And the onus is on us, and as I'm going to argue in a moment, the onus is also on our various levels of government to do something about this. So what can I do? We coined this in my lab. Every lab has their own variant of this, but we call it lifestyle cross-training. The Victoria Marathon is coming up, and for people who are runners, you of course are into cross-training. You're not just running on a regular basis, because injuries can accrue and so on. You might be kayaking or rowing or these sorts of things. You're engaging in various types of physical activity. And in terms of cognitive or health interventions, it's the same thing. I would not put all my eggs in the cognitive training basket. And I also wouldn't put all my eggs in the exercise basket. I would take a sampling from a number of the different areas that I'm just about to present, and I would make them a necessary part of your everyday life. Exercise, we've talked about ad nauseum, so I'm not going to say much more about it, but I like this point. even if exercise does absolutely zero in terms of preventing or delaying Alzheimer's disease, we know for a fact it improves cognitive function. I'd be happy with that. And we also know that it prevents all sorts of chronic diseases. It mitigates disease risk factors. It lessens disability. It can address depression. GPs actually prescribe physical activity now to try to lessen depression above and beyond medication. I think that this is a wonderful change that's going on in our healthcare system. So even if it does nothing vis-a-vis our cognition or our risk for Alzheimer's disease, it does something for all these other things that may or may not be influencing our lives. And there is reasonable evidence, in fact, to suggest that those who are exercising as few as 15 minutes a day, 3 times a week, are going to reduce their risk by 35 to 40%. And I show this slide, I'm cheating a little bit here, it's actually germane to health, but this was a study that came out this year. There was a big expose in the Globe and Mail about it. And what they basically said is some of us, based on limitations, simply aren't able to exercise for 15 or 30 minutes at a time. It really is taxing, or we have certain functional immobilities that don't permit us to do that. Well, what they're referring to as microbursts of activity are cumulative. You don't have to necessarily even do it all at once. It's prescribed that way, but you can derive benefit cumulatively throughout your day by doing at least microbursts of these moderate exercises. And this is too small to read, but it includes things like sweeping the floor, vacuuming, cooking, bathing the dog, gardening, painting the fence. I don't know how many times you can do that in a year, but lawn mowing, shoveling, and so on. So, and I actually think that there are going to be studies coming online soon in the dementia literature that are not necessarily going to be focusing on these more regimented 30-minute, 3-time-a-week prescriptions of aerobic activity. They're going to start looking at the relative health benefits of the cumulative effects of these activities as well. And there's reasonable evidence that comes from the religious order study, for example, in the US, that says you can lessen your risk by almost half if you do cognitive types of activities, but not these contrived things in the laboratory, and not these newfangled software programs necessarily, but things that you actually enjoy. You can interact with family and friends doing, or do them on your own. Listen to the radio, read newspapers, visit museums, come to public talks, these sorts of things. They do make a difference. And there's also some reasonable research on the social side alone that says a limited social network is not a good thing. Keeping in touch with family and friends regularly, even if you're exhausted one evening and you don't much feel like going to socialize as planned, this can be very good for your health. It can be very good for your cognition. And if it's enjoyable, hey, best of both worlds. And a good colleague, Art Kramer, in Illinois, actually advocates now combining both these things. He talks about walking book clubs, for example. Paying attention to diet, I think, is a risk factor that we can control. It's not definitive in terms of prevention of Alzheimer's, but it certainly is practical. And this one is related, the final one is related to the activity or the exercise. We really do have a lot of control over risk factors for disease. Again, I can't control my chronological age. I can't control my genetic makeup, but I can control how much risk I put myself at based on the types of behaviors that I engage in. So, and you see things down here like diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, cholesterol. These are all part of a vascular constellation, sometimes dubbed the metabolic syndrome, for example. Those things we can have control over based on diet, based on activity, and some people have to work harder than others by virtue of the biology that we've been born with. But I promise you that it's worthwhile redoubling one's effort to try to minimize those sorts of risk factors. And in closing, this I'm getting back to the policy piece. So you think about that original slide where I said if we do nothing, if we don't learn anything more about the mechanisms, if we don't figure out effective interventions, that we're going to go from a $150 billion a year healthcare enterprise to an $800 billion a year healthcare enterprise within about 30, 35 years. These are projections. They often break down at extremes, but I think we can all fully understand that the numbers are not going to stay the same as they are today. It's going to get more expensive. And because we're aging, we have fewer taxpayers to take care of this. The system, and I'm not an expert in terms of healthcare, but I certainly have an opinion, and my opinion is that it's not sustainable in its current form, and there will have to be some changes. And this is where I believe that dementia is really as much about social policy and governance. It becomes, what I said earlier on, making some of these risk factors or ways to prevent these risk factors a necessary part of your everyday life.